Okay. Hi, guys. I know I'm a new face, so I just wanted to take a minute before we get started with session number 4 of Facts Based World Building to introduce myself. My name is Rue. I am brand new to the experience team at Atlas Obscura here. So, hello. I'm actually coming to you from the East Coast, and I hope you're having a good day or as good of a day as you can have. I hope you are excited for this week's session. Just in case anyone here is new or hasn't been here in maybe the last session or so, I would just love to reiterate our statement. Here at Atlas Obscura, our mission is to inspire wonder and curiosity about the incredible world that we all share. Now more than ever, there's a need to stay connected. Not only to our sense of wonder and the world around us, but to each other, especially in this virtual space. So I really want to thank every one of you from the bottom of my heart, Moya included, for joining us today as we continue to explore ways to transition our real time experiential content into the virtual world. I'm also struggling to admit people, they're coming in so fast, man. Um, so I'm sure you've heard this in weeks prior, but we still encourage you to follow and share the hashtag OA experiences and to check out atlasobscura.com for more online courses like this, other shows, our Atlas of Amazing Places, and all our unique stories, trips, and videos. I'm going to go over housekeeping very quickly. Again, I know we're all pros here, especially with Zoom by now. Um, just as you have these last 4 sessions, you're going to continue to use this Zoom link to access further sessions, further lessons in this course. If you lose the link or it's not working, feel free to reach out to us directly. We'll get that fixed. Um, we usually encourage, as always, everyone to use speaker view as the best way to experience this course. But there may also be times where gallery view might be preferable. It depends on what Moya is going to put on the screen and how things are going. But feel free to toggle just using the setting at the top right of your Zoom screen. Um, and as a friendly reminder, all our sessions are recorded. This is for internal use as well as being able to provide a recording of this class for anybody who decides to tune in within the next week. If you do not want your face on camera, that's totally fine. You can toggle that off on the bottom of your screen by hitting stop video at any time. It's totally fine. Do whatever is most comfortable for you. Last but not least, if there are any questions or comments throughout the course, you can put them in the chat. Moya will be able to see it. I'll also be able to see it. So together we should be able to get everybody's questions in. If you find this distracting, however, you see a lot of text coming in, it's really bothering you, taking away from the course, you can go ahead and turn off your push notifications by going to preferences, finding the chat preferences, and turning push notifications off. Last but certainly not least, we are all very cool people for being here. Let's continue to be cool in the chat with each other. Um, I don't expect that anyone's going to be disruptive or disrespectful in any way. From what I hear, from what Moya tells me, you're all great friends by now. But just know if any of that is violated, if this becomes an unsafe space for any reason, you may be ejected without warning. So let's not have that happen. Hasn't happened yet. Um, and when all is said and done, I'm going to pass everything over to Moya. Enjoy your session, and I'm here if you need me.
Hey team, thanks for being with me tonight. It's a weird time and I don't really know how to address it, so I'm just going to talk to you about some cool biology facts. We're going to learn how to make a living species for our world. And then afterwards, when you go to the Google Classroom, hopefully you've been enjoying the discussions, then I'll ask you to create other species that can exist on our world, because we're not the only species. There are millions of species here on Earth, and it wouldn't make sense to build a world with just one species on it. All right. I've loved your answers coming into the icebreaker question. I think you should spend some time thinking about that. If there were some big catastrophic event that wiped out humans and 1,000,000 years passed or 100 million years passed, what would be left and what would rise to dominance? Would it still be humans? Like, would we survive that? Think about it. It's a fun thought experiment. Before we get into the biology stuff today, I have a few book recommendations for you. And the first recommendation is the biography of the continent Africa by John Reeder. It's specific, but it is long. This is a big chunk of a book, and it goes through talking about the formation of the actual continent. So it gives you a bit of a geology and geography, no, just geology history, and then it goes into the evolution of life that happened on the continent of Africa. So it's actually a great bridge between the geology lesson of last week and the biology lesson of this week. So I'll put all of the book recommendations in the Google Classroom and also on the slides before I send you the PDF. The title is Biography of the Continent Africa by John Reeder. Yeah. Right. We have another guest lecturer today. It was recorded ahead of time, so I didn't get to ask her what her favorite weird biology fact is. Someone in the Google Classroom asked for that. I'm sorry, but she's really cool, and here she is.
So my name is Stacy Farina. I'm an assistant professor at Howard University, and I study evolution of form and function. So I'm interested in how animals have come to look the way that they look in terms of their anatomy and a little bit of physiology. And in particular, I'm interested in biomechanics. So I'm interested in how animals use the anatomy that they evolved to interact with the physics of their environment. And so I think about that not just in an ecological and a physiological sense, but also in an evolutionary sense. So I think a lot about how animals develop these relationships between their anatomical systems and their physical world.
I'm sorry about the volume. If it feels low, turn up your volume on your computer. It's all the way up on my iPad, and I'll talk a little quieter so there's not a very extreme difference in volume. Stacy said that she studies anatomy and physiology of different species, and when I heard her say that, I had no idea what the difference between those two things is. English is hard, but I didn't know what the difference is. And so I wanted to teach you so that you can create both or think about both when you're creating your species.
Yeah, so physiology has more to do, I think, with molecules and reactions. So it's more about the chemistry of the body, and anatomy is more about the structures. And there can be a lot of overlap. So when you start to talk about the digestive system, you can talk about the anatomy of the stomach and all of the different layers of the digestive tract that have different functions from an anatomical perspective. But then you can also get into what those tissues are producing in terms of the enzymes that are used to break down different compounds and things like that. And so there's like when you talk about musculoskeletal systems, you're talking about like lever arms and what it takes to run, jump, swim, eat, breathe. That is a lot more anatomy and biomechanics, because you're thinking about, you know, the shape of the structures and how that shape of the structures is designed to interact with the environment. But then when you start talking about things like digestion and reproduction and stuff like that, it gets more into physiology. But there's a lot of overlap. Like obviously every single system that we have in our bodies has an anatomical component and a physiological component. So chemistry is involved and anatomy is involved with every system.
So when you're making your aliens, or if you want to focus on Earth, but you want to create a new species to live here, that'd be dope. When you're doing that, think about their body parts, that's the anatomy, and also the internal chemical processes, that's more of the physiology side of things. Most of this lecture is going to be about evolution, and there's evolution on different scales. You can have microevolution and macroevolution. We're going to talk about microevolution first, although Stacy is a self-proclaimed macroevolutionary biologist.
Migration is one mechanism of evolution. Just if you have a population of organisms and then you have a migrant come in from another population of the same species, now it's changed by just being a different individual. It's changed the genetic structure of a population, and therefore evolution has happened within the amount of time that it takes the organism to move from one place to another. So it can happen, you know, it doesn't have to be over generations. It doesn't have to even be technically over hours. but we tend to think about the changes that happen over longer periods of time because those are the changes that we tend to think of as more consequential. So if the genetic structure, like if you take, if you take a bus full of students and you drive them from DC to Arizona, you haven't changed the genetic structure of that group of students. But if if you introduce a new person onto the bus, now you've changed the structure of that population because now you have, like, every person has different genes. And
That's very weird. I guess that's the end of the video. My bad. So evolution is a lot simpler than I thought it was. Evolution is any change to the genetic makeup of a population. We like to think of it as, evolution happens when a species loses a tail, or evolution happens when one species splits off and becomes two different species that can't breed with each other anymore. But it's actually just any change to the gene pool. Microevolution happens with 4 different mechanisms. The first mechanism is migration, because when people move around, it introduces and mixes new genes into the pool. And once those people who come to a new place, once they breed with the people who are already there, I'm saying people. By people, I just mean like life forms. This happens across species. It's not just humans. But once the people breed with the locals, then their genes get carried on to future generations, if you have sexual reproduction, which we will talk about in a bit. So migration is the first mechanism that makes evolution happen. Mutation is the second one.
I think every time a human is born, they have 10 unique mutations, like on average, in their genome. Yeah.
That's so cool. Or
Yeah, no, it's
horrible.
awesome. What?
Is it bad? Like, not all mutations are bad, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the vast majority of mutations have no consequences whatsoever. So that's why we end up with a whole bunch of mutations, because like many of them have no effect on our biology whatsoever. And of course, there are mutations that do really bad things, and then less commonly mutations that might convey some sort of advantage. But for the most part, mutations are neutral. And so what it means is that every single human has a unique genome, which we know. But there are even differences from your parents. You're inheriting what your parents have, but also you have your own genetic mutations that make you distinct from any aspect of their genome too.
Different species mutate at different rates. So we have on average 10 mutations per generation, but some species have much higher mutation rates. And the rate depends kind of on environmental factors. So if you have an environment that's less stable, it's advantageous for a species to have a higher mutation rate to get a lot of variability or variation in the gene pool. Because if you have more mutations, then you're more likely to find something that will help you succeed or thrive in this rapidly changing environment. Mutation rates are higher among asexual species, species that reproduce asexually, which makes a lot of sense because you don't have this mixture of genes from a couple of parents to create variation in the gene pool. Mutations are great because, it promotes diversity, which is great in life and also in genetics. And there are a lot of different ways that mutations can happen. This link will take you to an article that describes the different ways. It's not just, oh, the mutation happened, but there are actual scientific ways that they do happen if you're interested in reading about them. The third mechanism is genetic drift. And I think this is really important for world builders to understand because this is where the randomness comes in. I told you in our first lecture that biology is a consequence of environment, but also randomness. And this is the randomness that I was talking about.
Let's say you have a really small population, and this actually does occur very commonly on islands, and you have a mutation that in larger populations would just sort of exist. It wouldn't necessarily be rooted out, or it wouldn't necessarily take hold. But then in a small population, just by random chance, that gene, that new copy of that gene may become fixed in the population, in the population's genome, just due to like, the fact that there's just always a chance of a copy of a gene getting to a certain frequency that it becomes permanent in the population. And so it's that's why it's genetic drift. So, and one really cool example is there's an island in Micronesia where 10% of the population has complete color blindness, and complete color blindness is extremely rare. You almost never see it, but because I think they had a storm, several generations ago, and it wiped out, unfortunately, all but like 15 people. And one of those people happened to have this extremely rare condition, and that person, had reproductive success within the society. Take that what you will, and so now a certain percentage of people that live on the island just have this color blindness because due to just the random chance of this gene taking hold in the population. So there's random forces, and it seems silly to say that a random force is a mechanism of evolution, but it does, especially with these tiny populations, it does actually really result in evolution.
That's really helpful from a world building perspective, because it means an author or a creator can make a random decision that will influence their population, and it's not totally unfounded in reality. That's nice.
Oh yeah.
All right, so Amanda asked, is genetic drift a consequence of mutation? And it can be. That's one way that a gene pool can drift in one direction or another. Genetic drift can also happen, like in Stacy's example, when you just have a very small population with limited options for reproducing, and one person has this gene that is usually really rare, but because they happen to be more successful reproductively, then that rare gene gets becomes more common in the subsequent generations. And Justin asked, would this relate to micro versions of animals, smaller populations on islands? Yeah, that's why you see small islands or small chains of islands, like the Galapagos, I think is probably the most famous example, that have a lot of biodiversity, because they're in these small isolated populations. You just have a lot of opportunity for genetic drift to happen and take hold and create divergent evolutionary paths, even in spaces that seem very small and close together, like physical spaces. The fourth mechanism is natural selection.
Which is like when the environment is imposing some sort of selective pressure onto the organisms. There are three major things that you need. So first, you need to have variation in a population. Mm-hmm. So if everybody in the population has the same genetics and also the same anatomy, the same traits, then there's nothing for natural selection to do with that. So there has to be variation in the population. And number two is that variation has to be heritable. So those traits that we talk about that vary have to be able to be passed from one generation to the next.
Mm-hmm. What are some things that aren't heritable?
That's a good question, because most of the traits that we think about at least have some genetic component, and so heritable just means that at least some aspect of it can be passed down. And so height is an example of a kind of a complicated one, because height has to do with your parents' height, so it is heritable, but it also has to do with your environmental factors. So it has to do with like what you ate, the kinds of exercise that you did and things like that. So there's a strong genetic component, but there's also an environmental component. And a lot of traits are like that, where it's not just an on and off thing. But as long as there's some sort of genetic component to it, natural selection can act on it. But anything that you acquire in life, so for example, like if you get really good at knitting, you're not going to be able to pass that on to the next generation unless you teach your offspring how to knit.
I don't know. I feel like my mom definitely passed on all of her knowledge of 80s music to me in the womb.
So those traits have to be variable and they have to be heritable. And they also have to have some influence on your ability to survive and reproduce. So your knowledge of 80s music, if it were heritable, may or may not affect your ability to survive and reproduce. But your ability to gather food and your ability to run fast, those are all things that in different environments might allow some individuals in the population to be more likely to survive than others.
Can confirm my knowledge of 80s music has not made me better at surviving or reproducing so far. While we're on the topic of natural selection, I want to point out two different versions of Origin of the Species. If you haven't read it, it's Charles Darwin's kind of like big deal work about how evolution and natural selection work. The term survival of the fittest comes from Darwin's work, and I, for some reason, have two versions of this in my one-bedroom New York apartment. So one is like an illustrated version, a graphic version of Origin of the Species by Michael Keller, which is beautiful and is great if you don't want to get into the like weeds, but if you want some kind of visual inspiration, this is really good. This will be on the list that I include in the Google Classroom. The next is another big chunk of a book, but it's the annotated Origin of the Species. It's by Charles Darwin, and then it's annotated by James Costa. So it's pretty thick, but it not only has Darwin's work, but then a bunch of descriptions and explanations about how Darwin's work has been updated since he was alive in the 1800s. That's a long time ago. We've learned some stuff since then. Stacy wasn't even alive back then. So yeah, it's a whole new field these days. That's that book recommendation. Now on to macroevolution, which works through the same four mechanisms as microevolution. So the four mechanisms, again, are mutation, migration, genetic drift, and natural selection. And macroevolution is microevolution, but on big scales.
So you have a speciation, which is just like one species splits in.
Okay, I meant for the text to show up before I started playing the video, but macroevolution is evolution that happens on levels bigger than species. So microevolution is within one species. Macroevolution is the reason we have millions of species on our planet.
So you have a speciation, which is just like one species splits into two, but then irradiation would be like, okay, so you start with one species and then you do a bunch of splits and then you have a whole bunch of species that you didn't have before. So some groups go through that process more quickly than others. We like to think about sort of prehistoric looking or primitive looking organisms that basically have stayed unchanged. So sharks are a great example, and sharks are relatively diverse. Like I said, like it's an older group than the ray finned fishes. So there's the ray finned fishes that have like 34,000 species of fish. So everything that you think of typically as a bony fish falls in that group. But then sharks, there are only about 1,000 of them, 1,000 species of elasmobranchs, and then sharks themselves, I think it's like 700 or 500, and they look, most sharks look very similar to what you would find in the fossil records. But then you have things like seahorses and deep sea anglerfish. Like you have like, you know, like it's very clear looking at the evolutionary history of a seahorse that it hasn't really been around for very long. So there are some groups that seem to change really quickly, and some groups that seem to maintain their traits for long periods of time, you know, millions and millions of years. So that's kind of a cool story thing, because, you know, you can imagine like a creature in the deep that's basically been unchanged for millions of years.
Yeah.
Sort of cool to think about. Because we don't actually know why some species spend long periods of time unchanged and some change. Because like you can have, you know, animals like in the same environment, and like one group of animals will stay unchanged and the other group of animals in the exact same environment will diversify and speciate and radiate.
So maybe you don't find that as comforting as I do, that the entire evolutionary history of our whole planet is kind of just a big shrug, but I find it really comforting from a world building perspective, because you have so much freedom. You can do so much, you can make so much up. And I think that's really awesome from a world building point of view. There are different ways that you can drive or motivate macroevolution to happen. Like Stacy just said, we don't know all of the reasons why some species evolve faster and radiate more than others, but we have some ideas of events that will drive that forward.
So natural selection can be sort of ticking along and sort of fine-tuning things, but then you get these sort of big moments of change, and it could be associated with a mass extinction, like, you know, the asteroid killing a bunch of dinosaurs. And that really radically changed the trajectory of mammals, because now mammals have all of this environment to be able to inhabit without the threat of these predators that were once sort of keeping their diversity at bay. But then there's also innovation that sort of comes across over longer periods of time. So one of the examples of that is the evolution of pharyngeal jaws, which are jaws in the pharynx of fish. So you've got the oral jaws, which are out at front, and the things you normally think of as jaws. But then you have jaws in the back of the throat, and what they actually are modified gill arches. So they've lost their respiratory function, and instead they can be used for things like chewing and grinding prey.
So they can just like chew all the way down their throats?
Yeah, or in the back of the throat, like they'll have like a second set of jaws, almost like Alien. So teeth are really cool because like we associate teeth with the jaw, but like teeth can kind of go wherever they want. They usually stay in the jaw, but like, you know, teeth are basically, they evolved from scales, and scales can be everywhere. And so teeth can kind of migrate around. And so some of the teeth might have migrated to the back of the throat, and that might have caused an advantage for some of the species. But then, like, let's say that they, instead of, you know, incisor or pointy leg teeth, let's say that some of them had molars, and then all of a sudden they have molars in the back of their throat that they can now use to grind stuff, and then slowly over time those molars become like really crazy molars. Like you can see like some fish have like crazy molars in the back of their throat for crushing things. But that happens sort of over a long period of time, but it's still innovation. And then once the pharyngeal jaws really took hold, then you see this massive radiation, because now these fish that maybe could only eat like other fish before, now they can eat, they can grind up plant material, they can eat snails, they can crush snails, they can crush hard prey, they can crush crustaceans and things like that. So you go from having fish that are pretty limited in what their mouth can do, and now all of a sudden they have this ability to process prey in a way they didn't before.
All right, so I want to highlight a couple things that Stacy just said. First, she said that teeth can go anywhere and that they evolve from scales. I think my jaw appropriately dropped when she said that, but I have recently learned that so teeth come from scales, but feathers also come from scales, and hair and nails come from the same stuff too. So they're all like different versions of keratin that is a thing that our body produces. And so all of those things are connected, which means wherever you find one of those things, you can definitely imagine a scenario where you can substitute one of those other things in. So like instead of hair, if we like we're humans, but we had feathers, like if we evolved from birds instead of apes, for example. So that's a wacky example, but they're all connected. So you can think of scenarios where you can interchange them. Another thing I want to point out is that she said after the pharyngeal jaws, after the teeth in the back of the throat were developed, then that created this big radiation. So once one species figured out how to do that, it led to the creation of a lot of different species. And this is something that happens a lot in evolution. So another example of this is it took a really long time for organisms, for like tiny little one or like couple cellular organisms to figure out how to use oxygen to metabolize stuff, to get energy from the environment. And once that happened, there was this huge, big speciation or radiation event where once organisms on Earth figured out how to use oxygen, and then once there was enough oxygen in the atmosphere because of beautiful cyanobacteria that photosynthesized and put oxygen in the atmosphere, then you have a lot of different animals, a lot of different species, a lot of different things using oxygen to metabolize and then just like branching off and doing their own thing. And someone asked an interesting question. Amy asked, are we considered fast or slow, or have we not been around long enough to tell? That's a really great question. I don't know. If I had to give you an answer, I'd say we probably haven't been around long enough because humans are relatively new. I do remember hearing people talk about how humans have like stopped evolving, and how we've seen evolution in the fossil record in the last 200 million years for other animals and plants and everything, but we haven't seen much evolution for humans. So I would say we still don't have enough information to tell for sure. Are beaks teeth too? I mean, they're probably in the same lineage, right? Beaks to me seem more like nails, but nails come from like keratin. It's the same stuff as our hair, which means it comes from feathers, which means it goes back to scales, which means, you know, it's all related. So yeah, I I don't think beaks are made of bone. I think they're made of softer stuff. But someone did ask how animals got skeletons in the Google Classroom, and I didn't include the answer in the presentation, but I looked it up, and it's pretty cool. Animals were able to develop skeletons after different calcium-based life forms in the ocean. So essentially like algae that over time, over many, many millions of years became chalk on the bottom of the ocean. We started eating that chalk. I say we, it wasn't just humans, it was like all animals, or like the very early animals. We started eating that chalk and then we could absorb and use that calcium to create harder stuff like bones or shells or wings on beetles. So anything that has an exoskeleton, it's similar hard stuff made of calcium. A few people ask questions about breeding between species and how you can tell species apart. And Stacy's here to give us the answers.
What makes something a different species?
What those sort of theories are called are like species concepts. And so the reproduction one is the biological species concept. So the classic definition is two groups that can no longer interbreed. And not just interbreed as in produce an offspring, but then that offspring has to be fertile and be able to produce other offspring.
Okay.
But hybridization happens, and this is another kind of cool evolutionary thing that could get worked into a story. You know, hybrids happen all the time, and fertile hybrids happen too. Like, and they can be completely different species. And it happens in fish quite often that you'll have like a bluegill sunfish and a pumpkin seed sunfish, which are distinct species. Like you can find genetic differences between them that are very, very well solidified in the population, but you can bring them together and they can make fertile offspring just, you know, like normal. And even things sometimes that are really different from each other. I think one of the big ones recently they found is that sturgeons and paddlefish, which are closely related. Like sturgeons are like these big, like armored, ancient-looking fish. That's another example of a group that's spent a long time unchanged. And then paddlefish are the closest relatives of sturgeons, but they probably split about, I think the estimate is like at least 100 million years ago. And so they've been split for a long time, and there are lots of paddlefish and there are lots of sturgeons, but then they found that one species of paddlefish was able to interbreed with this one species of sturgeon, and the offspring looked totally wonky. Like, it's like paddlefish have this big paddle-like nose, and so now you have these armored fish with a paddle-like nose. Crazy.
And so is that hybrid now considered a new species of its own?
No, and actually now that I think about it, I'm not sure that they've proven it's fertile.
Okay.
But no, because I don't think hybrids are generally never considered to be their own species. I'm trying to think of an example where that wouldn't be true, but the hybrids just sort of exist in nature. They're sort of in this weird in-between spot of, you know, belonging to one species or another. They just sort of exist. And if you were to separate the two species, the hybrids would go away. So there's usually like a hybrid zone where the two species are interacting with each other. And if that hybrid zone were to go away for some reason, the hybrids would too.
I am just imagining a really messed up world where two different species realize that they can interbreed and create hybrids that aren't fertile, and they just like keep creating them for free labor, and it's horrible. But I can just okay, cool.
That's really dark.
Yeah, sometimes world building gets really dark.
But there are other species concepts, and so there's like, and I don't know if this is, I don't know their technical terms, but there's like the genetic species concept, which is, you know, you say, okay, we're going to define these species as species if they're different enough in their genomes that we are, and it's a little bit arbitrary because like I don't like that number is going to be different for different groups of organisms. And then there's also like the phylogenetic species concept, which is to say, okay, if we have a common ancestor and then it splits off into two and we can follow that split in the genome, then we're going to call it a different species. But I think like one of the reasons that you can't have one united species concept is because every group is a little bit different. So some groups hybridize really well, so you can't use the biological species concept.
Yeah, so even biologists can't agree on how to differentiate species. They actually also don't even agree on what is alive, like what the definition of life is, which to me seems weird because like that's what they study. But you know, who am I to judge? Astronomers don't know what dark energy is, and it makes up 85% of the universe. So, you know, whatever. But there are a bunch of different species concepts. Mostly you can think about this. I think this is really useful if you have multiple intelligent, dominant, powerful species on your world. Otherwise, it's, you know, you're probably not going to get a lot of situations where the characters in your story, if you have a story, are, you know, breeding with members of another species. That's just like unlikely to happen unless you have multiple dominant species on your world. Okay, I was really excited about this one because I was a huge taxonomy nerd in high school. So taxonomy is how, at least in biology, is how they split up and categorize different species. Yeah, so I see Amy saying King Philip came over from Great Spain. Oh, that's interesting. That's not the one I learned in high school. I think the one I learned had something to do with spaghetti, but they've recently added a new one above kingdom called domain. And the domain is defined by, like the distinction between the three different domains is defined by how the cells are made up. You have probably heard, or if you remember anything from your high school biology class, you've heard the words eukaryote and prokaryote. Those have to do with cells. So eukaryotes have a nucleus in the cell. The nucleus is like the center, the head of the cell, the brain of the cell almost. And then prokaryotes don't have a nucleus in their cell. But recently, like in the past 15 years or so, they split up prokaryotes into archaea and bacteria, two different categories, because even though neither one of them has a nucleus in their cell, their walls of the cells are made up of different stuff. So they decided to split them off. Underneath these three domains are 6 different kingdoms. And so there's one kingdom for bacteria called eubacteria, which apparently a biologist considered true bacteria. And then there's archaeobacteria, which we used to think was bacteria, but isn't somehow. You would have to dig more into this. That's why I include the links, so I don't have to know everything and say it out loud. And then under eukarya, remember these are cells that have nuclei. They have a nucleus in their cell. There are 4 different types of kingdoms, and these are the groups that we're most familiar with. Protists, okay, the least familiar, but then fungi, which look like plants. A lot of people think they're plants, but they don't photosynthesize, so they are not plants. And then there's animals and plants. And they evolved differently at different times, which I think is really exciting. On Earth, life started in the water, which is why astronomers look for water when we're looking for habitable planets, because that's how it started here. And it's not a fluke, right? Water is really good. It's the universal solvent. It's really good at dissolving different compounds and materials. And when you can dissolve materials, when you can split them up into their component parts, then it creates an opportunity for those individual parts to mix together in new ways. And that's how you get life. At least that's how we got life here on Earth. Most animals here on Earth live in and around the water, so there are way more marine creatures than there are land-dwelling creatures, which I think is really interesting. Plants, which is a different track, a different evolutionary track from animals. plants happened first. They started photosynthesizing about 1.6 billion years ago, and they moved on to land only about 500 billion years ago. And we owe everything to plants. If it weren't for plants, we wouldn't have oxygen in our atmosphere. It was cyanobacteria. Roger mentioned that they, totally ruined the planet for themselves, but they made it great for us. So thanks, cyanobacteria. But cyanobacteria created oxygen, more photosynthesizing plants created the ozone layer, which made it possible for animals to crawl out from the ocean onto the surface, because before that, the surface wasn't safe. It was being bombarded by radiation from the sun. But remember, our type of star is less massive, it's cooler, it just has less energy than our sun, so maybe we don't have to wait as long for the surface of our world to become habitable. Animals didn't appear until about 800 million years ago. It took them a long time, and biologists still don't really know why they did that. I went into a deep rabbit hole earlier this week, and I found a term called endosymbiosis, which was really cool. And some biologists attribute life to this term, endosymbiosis. So plants and animals have parts of their cells called mitochondria. Maybe you've heard the word mitochondria. It's the powerhouse of the cell. Well, we think that mitochondria used to be its own, I say we, again, I'm not involved in this. Some biologists think that mitochondria used to be their own organisms like bacteria existing out in the world on their own. And what used to happen before there were multicellular organisms is these tiny cells would just eat each other over and over again. They would just eat each other. But sometimes an organism, a cell, would eat another cell and it couldn't digest it. And once you eat a cell and you can't digest it, it's a part of you. And then it wants to, I know I'm anthropomorphizing all of this, but it's how I understand it. So the cell that got eaten now wants to work with the big cell that is now at this point, I guess, a host cell. And so we think that mitochondria was eaten by a host cell and then started working with it, because if the host cell survives, then the eaten cell survives. That was my rant about endosymbiosis, which made it possible for plants and animals to do things like photosynthesize. It made it possible for us to use oxygen to metabolize. It made it possible for us to convert different types of fuel or food into sugar that we can use as energy. Endosymbiosis is really cool. Yeah. Oh, I did have a couple of books that I wanted to talk about. So this book by Richard Dawkins and Yan Wang is called The Ancestor's Tale. It's pretty cool. It's like the title is a nod to the Canterbury Tales. And so it goes through the entire evolutionary history of the Earth. Another big chunk of a book. So many big chunks. I just love that word, chunk. So I would recommend this book if you want to learn more about these different evolutionary paths. We didn't even talk about things like viruses and bacteria, which are tied to illnesses mostly. That's how we interact with them, although we all have a bunch of bacteria in our gut helping us digest things. We have a lot of good viruses. Someone earlier mentioned a really cool thing that viruses did for us, but it's real far back. So if you want to say it again, write it again in the chat. But virus is bad right now. Virus is enemy number one right now, but some viruses are good. And so this book is called The Emperor of All Maladies. It's all about cancer, not illnesses or viruses or bacteria in general. It's by Siddhartha Mukherjee, and I just wanted to use it as an example of something that can trace the evolutionary history of an illness, something that is not a plant or an animal. Cool.
I think I found the question about viruses, if that's what you're looking for. It came from C Camp. I had heard that organisms gestating internally happened as a result of species having their genes modified by a virus of millions of years ago. Is that what we're looking for?
That is what I was looking for. Yeah,
Okay.
I haven't read that, but yeah, that would be really awesome. I do know that a lot of genetic variation has happened because of viruses coming in and interacting with our cells and changing the DNA in our bodies. And that's why viruses aren't always bad, because sometimes they make good changes. Okay. I said earlier that I would talk about reproduction, but the different types of reproduction, because 99% of animals reproduce sexually, but not all life forms on Earth are animals, and not all animals reproduce sexually. So let's look at the other options.
Some groups don't have sexual reproduction at all, so you can't use the biological species concept, like bacteria and stuff. Not only do they not sexually reproduce, and so it's really hard to follow different lineages, but also they have horizontal gene transfer, where which means instead of vertical, so like one generation to the next, it's horizontal, which means one individual to another. So bacteria, through bacteriophages, like little viruses that transmit like bacterial genomic information, like they can, like a part of the genome of one bacteria can get literally spliced into another bacteria. When you think about bacteria, it's more useful to think about like, you know, different like a colony of bacteria over here, and some of that genetic, like as some cells die, or as they get like, you know, as like a phage comes along and takes the genetic material, like some of those cells might die. The original like colony will still be intact, so that species will still exist. But then if that genetic material makes its way over to this other bacterial colony and gets inserted into that genome, then those genes are going to take hold in that bacterial strain. And so everybody's still sort of around, but it's just more like genes get transferred between, you know, different sort of pockets of bacteria.
Are they like slingshotting their genetic material over? Do they just like run at each other really fast and merge? Like how?
There's a certain amount of genetic material from bacteria just in the environment. Bacteria and viruses. So viral DNA can get, or viral RNA can get spliced into the genome of a bacteria. There's a reason why it's really easy to contaminate a DNA sample. Like you talk about, like, you know, you hear in forensics, like, oh, the sample got contaminated. It's because, like, if you aren't really careful to sterilize everything, there's just an ambient amount of genetic material just like kicking around from when cells die. Like, and so if some other bacteria end up picking that up into their genome, it's more of a random process.
Jeff asks, is this more of a bacterial form of reproduction, or do others do this in some way? Yeah, other things that aren't just bacteria also have horizontal gene transfer. So there are different organisms that can clone themselves. They can fission themselves. I think that's the right verb, where, you know, there's one of them and then they just kind of split off, like mitosis. I think I'm remembering my high school bio vocab right. And budding, which is its own thing. And this link will take you to an article that describes the different ways that you can have horizontal gene transfer or asexual reproduction. But then there's also vertical gene transfer, which is what we're more familiar with, where you have two, at least, or at most, around two. The average is two parents who then pass their genetic material onto their offspring. But even within vertical gene transfer or sexual reproduction, you have options. So you can fertilize internally or externally. I think this is what we were talking about, this internal gestation, thanks to that virus millions of years ago. So fertilization can happen internally. That's what we do, where you like hold on to the baby in your womb. And then fertilization can happen externally. This is what a lot of fish do, where you lay your eggs and then something comes along and fertilizes them afterwards. That's how the life forms in my science fiction novel did it. They fertilized externally, and that led to this really fun, I think, family dynamic, where instead of like two parents and a baby, it was more of a communal upbringing, because no one knew which kid was theirs. Because, you know, you just like laid your eggs in the middle of the village, and then some stranger came along, not stranger, but like some unknown person came along and fertilized it. I'm spending way too much time talking about egg fertilization. Let's move on to biomechanics. Parthenogenesis is found in some species of lizards and lots of amphibians. Thank you, Roger. Yeah, so parthenogenesis is I guess it's a type of asexual reproduction. where you can reproduce without a partner?
I mean, biomechanics as a field is really fascinating. Like there are some basic principles. Like I can give you some like general toolkits. So for example, you tend to see long limbs in things that move really quickly, and it has to do with levers. So so you tend to see long limbs in things that move really quickly, but then you see short limbs in things that need to be really powerful. And the reason is because if you have a long out lever to a short in lever, that is going to increase speed. And one of the when I explain this to my students, I usually have a paddle with me because you can see like competitive rowers have extremely long oars. And the reason is because it gives them a long out lever, and then they have a small in lever that they're pulling on. And so basically the same motion of moving their hands just a few inches gives a much wider arc for the same amount of time. And so increasing distance in the same amount of times, it increases your speed. So you've got, increased distance per second. So long out lever, short in lever gives you speed.
Mhm.
But then if you want something to be really strong, you need the complete opposite. You need a long out lever and you need a long in lever and a short out lever, or a shorter out lever. So for example, like the crowbar is the example that I use in class. Like I have a crowbar that I pull out and I actually use it to break something. Like the out lever, the in lever of a crowbar is like the whole long arm. So you've got this long arm that's basically amplifying the amount of force that you're able to exert with this tiny little out lever that's at the end of your crowbar. And so you can amplify your own force. And so it's the same thing if you have like big hip muscles that are attaching to like half the leg and then like a tiny little, limb at the end of it. So you've got like a short out lever, but a really long in lever. Then you've got a really powerful, strong system.
Got it. Like an alligator or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
But you can also, I mean, one of the great examples is jaws. So jaws can be really strong. So like long and skinny jaws, like you see long and skinny jaws in things that eat fish, like that have to be fast. So you see in an alligator jaw, or there are like these alligator crocodilians with like really long jaws called gharials, and like they just like want to snap really quickly. But if you see like short and stubby jaws, like in a shark, their jaw muscles like insert about like halfway to the front of the jaw, so that they have like a really long in lever and a shorter out lever, so that they can really crush things. So powerful jaws are not going to be long and skinny. They're going to be short and stubby with the muscles inserting as far forward as they can get. There's also like drag. So things that live in the water are going to tend to be torpedo shaped, because if they're not, they're going to create a lot of pressure drag. So they're going to have a big wake behind them. One of the cool things, so like animals, when they transitioned from being like, so when fish came out onto land, they tetrapods, so land-dwelling animals, evolved a neck. So fish actually don't have any neck skeleton. They don't have any cervical vertebrae. They just have, basically, fish shoulders are attached to their skull.
Okay.
But when they went out of water, now all of a sudden you've got these land-dwelling animals that need to be able to look around, and they don't have to deal with drag. So one of the reasons to not have a neck is because it sort of messes with your torpedo shape if you start moving your head around. But then necks evolved, and then like millions and millions of years later, you had things like marine mammals, so things like whales going back into the water. And so whales actually do have cervical vertebrae, but they've been like compressed really, really tiny. So like a whale, like you can have a huge whale and the cervical vertebrae will be like all like compressed into this one little area. So they still have the neck skeleton, but when you look at them externally, they're torpedo shaped.
I just love that whales have tiny, tiny little necks that are just like it's really cute to me. I am tickled by that. So I'm gonna speed this up and not show the video for this miscellaneous section. So I'm actually just gonna go ahead and, can I delete that? Yeah, but I will show you the text. So there are basically no limits to what biology can do as long as it's already included in the gene pool. As long as there's a gene that can express something similar to that characteristic, go ahead. I even asked Stacy, so X-Men, like powers, is that possible? And her answer was, well, as long as it's in the gene pool, go for it. So go for it. Also, we talked about biological symmetry. There's a link in one of the earlier slides that does talk about when biological symmetry happened, when animals started to have this bilateral symmetry where we have, like 2 arms and 2 legs, everything. And that is easier because it's just easier for your genes to make like a mirror image. Like it doesn't have to do as much work. It doesn't have to save as much information if you're symmetrical, but it's not necessary. There are also other types of symmetry. We have bilateral symmetry where it's like split down the middle of this one axis, but you can also have radial symmetry like a jellyfish or an octopus or a starfish. Notice I'm giving mostly marine animal examples because most animals, most living things on Earth are in the water. And then the last few are questions that people asked in the Google Classroom. So some people asked about intelligence. Can it happen in oceans? Because it's so weird that we are the most intelligent things on the planet and we live on land, even though most things live in the water. And based on my digging, it seems like dexterity, the ability to use tools, however you want to, is what drives intelligence. And that can happen in oceans, especially with things that have tentacles. So we have opposable thumbs, which is why we have dexterity, but tentacles also let different organisms like use and grasp tools. I don't know why my slides went away. Technology is not my friend tonight. The other question that someone asked was about silicon-based life forms, which is possible, but is tricky. So it would be really difficult on a planet like Earth, but would be much more likely on a planet or on a world more like Titan, one where there's less water and there's more methane and more other things that silicon won't react badly with. And some people asked about aging. Aging happens because genes deteriorate, they get worse at copying themselves, and that is related to lifespan, the like maximum lifespan of a species, which some biologists think is like a general rule of thumb is that it's inversely proportional to your metabolism. So if you have a really slow metabolism, you're going to live a long time. If you have a really fast metabolism, you probably won't live for as long. But there are other factors involved here, like the temperature of the environment you live in. Things that live in really cold environments tend to live longer. Your size is a factor. Bigger things tend to live longer, which I think is kind of counterintuitive. Because I was always told that I shouldn't get too tall because then I'm going to die early. But maybe that was just my parents, messing me up like parents do sometimes. That got dark. What else? Things to think about. So when you are thinking about creating a species on your world, let's do this really quickly right now. How many dominant species do we want to have? I'll take the first answer. 3. Megan. Okay, Megan, we're gonna have 3. What made them so successful? We are successful as a species because we are intelligent. So what made these 3? Let's focus on 1. We'll talk about 1. Tentacles made our first species intelligent. So Amy, you said tentacles. Does that mean you want our first dominant species to be in the ocean or in the water? We have a lot of water on our world. Yes. Okay. So first we have tentacles. When you say tentacles, do you want it to be an octopus or do you want it to be something else? Yes. Okay. How many tentacles does our octopus species have? I guess I should stop calling them an octopus. 12. So they're like a dodecapus? Okay. Great, thanks, Amy. All right, so that's our first species. We'll say tentacles made them successful. They are not very humanoid. Based on their biology, what do they need to survive? So yes, I see Ashley saying radial symmetry. Yeah, do we think that they're symmetrical? Yes. All right. I'm seeing Michael says they have big brains. I love that. Yeah, big brains are really advantageous for us. If they have big brains, then they probably need a lot of fuel. So I'm going to say they need to eat. What do they eat? Fish. All right. Michael, and you also wrote venom. Do you want them to be venomous? Yes. And Michael wants them to be cannibals. Do other people want them to be cannibals? No. Okay, so no, we're gonna nix the cannibalism. All right, cool. So they need to eat. Do they need to sleep? No. All right, let's go with no. So they still will need to go into a rest period, but let's say they don't sleep, and we are out of time. So we're gonna wrap this up in the Google Classroom. Next time, we're focusing on culture. We're going to start talking about the history. I do have a book that leads into that. It's called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society by Nicholas Christakis. It talks about the evolutionary history, but like of societies and bases it in evolution and biology. So I will put those in the Google Classroom. I'm sorry I went over time.
Boy, that's all right. Thank you guys so much. I hope you had fun today. I certainly had fun today. A reminder, a recording of today's class will be sent to all participants and available to view for a week using a temporary password. And then next week we will be here, same time, same place. My face will be here again too, so hopefully it's more familiar. And if you have any questions, I know we had a couple come in that we don't have time for. What Moya said, please put them in Google Classroom. I'm going to post the link one more time before we go. And other than that, have yourself a great night.
Take care, everyone.
Yes, take care. Good care.
Yeah.
And the link is in the chat.
Bye.